friends. My name is Steve, and we're here today to discuss all things House of Chains. We have some friends here that we've been reading the books with, and of course, the man himself, Steven Erikson. So we'll go ahead and start off with some introductions, and we will be getting into House of Chains and all the previous books. So if you have not read House of Chains yet, tune out and come back later. Don't spoil yourself. So, Layla, will you start us off with some introductions?
Sure. I'm Layla Goshi. I'm a professor of English in St. Louis, Missouri, right now. I have just launched a web magazine called Bellady Magazine, and just excited for that. I'm gonna delve into some fantasy sci-fi on cultural levels, how different cultures view fantasy and sci-fi.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's a little neat.
And Mr. Erikson?
Steven Erikson, presently writing the second book of the Witness trilogy. So I'm a little bit ahead of you guys, obviously. And I think I've got about 9 chapters left. So my initial plan was to be finished in the spring, and I should be able to reach that quite easily, I think. So that's good news. Also, I'm working on a book on writing. So I'm kind of doing that in my off hours when I'm sitting on the sofa watching a hockey game. I'll have my laptop and I'll be writing about writing, and so that's been a lot of fun.
Oh, nice. And Katerina?
Hi, I'm Katerina. I have been doing a read along with Steve of The Prince of Nothing for the past few months. So you might have seen me on the channel here and then. And apart from that, I'm also reading other series. And during our read along, we got into talking about the Malazan Book of Thalin. And so I'm very excited that you decided that I was worth being invited onto this discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Don't forget you're a podcaster now, so don't forget to mention that. Yeah.
True.
Yeah. So with House of, well, first let me ask you about the book that you're doing for writing. What have you remembered during that process that you haven't forgotten, but you hadn't thought about in a while? What's come out of you that you kind of forgot?
It's not. I don't know if it's a question of forgetting. It's the book is called The Ritual of Writing, and I think it's about remembering all of those aspects that have become so much a part of me now that I'm not even conscious of what I'm going through in terms of sitting down to write. And so what's made it interesting is I end up having to sort of keep backtracking in terms of my thinking to sort of lay down the foundations of what I'm going to present as an argument for not just beginning writers, but for published writers who are suffering from writer's block. I think there are ways around that kind of stuff, and so I'm going to be addressing some of that as well.
Yes, excited to get into that one.
Interesting. I had listened to Mr. Erikson. I had listened to an interview you did with another podcast where you were discussing the book a bit, and I was your writing book, and I'm one of those who earned the MFA. I even spent a summer in Iowa, but then I finished my MFA, and the next thing, finished it in August. September, I had my second child, so things kind of, deviated, and I've mostly written short stories and poetry, published that.
Oh,
but your topic of ritual really appeals to me because I get it. I've noticed for myself that ritual works for short pieces,
Mm-hmm.
and so I would be curious as to your thoughts about how ritual fits into a lengthy piece,
Right.
or producing a lengthy work, how it can help extend that. And
well, two things regarding that. One is and I'll get into more detail in the book, obviously, but the notion of ritual is actually based on it. You would think, if people are talking about that kind of stuff, they're talking about sort of the physical preparations and the mental preparations you need to go into, sit down into your writing room. And I will talk a little bit about that, but that's not the kind of ritual I'm talking about. And so what I'm talking about is actually training yourself to see the world in a particular way, where all of the raw stuff of the fiction you create is all around you. And it's there in your history, it's there in your background, and all the rest. So it is, and it's sort of exercising your natural proclivities, because I think artists are a bit weird that way. We're not quite normal. And we tend to establish a kind of emotional distance. And it's not necessarily a good thing, right? It's just something that happens. We find ourselves in situations where we do this kind of mental stepping back, and we start observing, and we start recording what we're seeing around us, which is not always a good thing. But recognizing that is kind of a tendency or a trait, and then putting a focus on it and putting it to use is kind of what I'm talking about in terms of ritual. But writer's block is not quite the same as what Stephen Donaldson told me was what he called life block. And life block is a very real thing, and that's something that we all have to face. And basically, it's where everyday domestic requirements, responsibilities, and all the rest can simply get in the way of the process of sitting down to write. And that, I don't know if there's any solution for that. I think it's something we all have to battle through in our own ways. So, and certainly having a child or two or three or whatever is a huge life block, because it's an energy draining experience. As rewarding as it is, it still drains you. So, and it drains. It certainly drained me, but nothing compared to how it drained my wife, for example. So,
yeah, I really related to Tattersall's, the reborn Tattersall's mother's story. That even as definitely it pays off to put your kids as a priority. So I'm not sorry that happened, but there's different phases in life, and yeah. Absolutely. So I look forward to reading your book.
Good.
And so with House of Chains, it was a bit of a departure from the previous books, in that we had a singular point of view with Karsa, the new character. Was that always planned to have that one POV to start this book? Was that
no,
that happened?
No, it wasn't planned. That was almost a knee-jerk reaction on my part, because a lot of criticisms of the earlier books, well, not a lot of them, but some were pointing out that it seems like Erikson can't stick with a single point of view. And of course, obviously, I had good reasons for all of these multiple points of view. But that kind of ticked me off, because I can stick with a single point of view if I choose to. So I sat down, and when I started the fourth book, I thought, okay, I'll stay with Karsa, and let's walk this through for a bit.
I thought that worked at this particular juncture of the series. I haven't read the rest yet, but it did give me a chance to focus, I think, on one, and maybe tie some threads together. And Steve and I had great fun talking about Karsa and his companions, and the banter and the humor that went along with it. And I said, sometimes I think I see humor where it might not have been intended, but I did appreciate Karsa being this young man out to see the world, and the boasting. I loved how he kept making his vows, and then his vows would fall apart. Like, I vow this dog will sleep on my hearth, and then and then later in House of Chains, I thought it was really poignant when he said, okay, I'm no longer going to make vows, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, learned his lesson, didn't he?
He learned his lesson, but it was great. It's a great arc.
Cool.
I also love this part in House of Change. It's one of my favorite couple of chapters in the 6 books of Malazan that I read so far. And I especially love how unrelenting it is, how so much in Karsa's perspective that you start with this like extremely narrow view of the world that he knows and the sort of rules, social rules that he thinks are the right rules, and he has very strong ideas on what he should be doing, what other people should be doing, and then as he starts traveling out and leaves the village and gradually descends into the lowlands, the world starts opening up as he's also learning about the world, and gradually that he's realizing that maybe the world isn't the way he thought it was. Maybe it's much more complicated than it seemed originally. And I really love that, how we go from this very narrow understanding of the world to this like really, really more complex picture.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of that tribal mindset that's at play there, where basically there have been, and maybe still are, tribal groups that define themselves as people, and everyone else are not people. They're something else, and so that's a very sort of centric kind of point of view. And I think for Karsa, it was more a case of, as he traveled, reality continually kicked him in the teeth, because he was simply not aware of just how complicated and how nuanced cultures and civilizations are. And I mean, maybe for me, probably my first experience of that was as an archaeologist flying to, landing in Mexico and then taking buses and hitchhiking down into Belize to work on a dig. And those are my first real experiences with a culture that is significantly not my own. And that was very eye-opening at the time, for sure. And you start realizing that, things are a lot more complicated. And as much as I grew up in Canada, I mean, pretty much in a state of poverty, but there is a certain level of support that exists in a Western nation and a Western country of that sort that simply is not there in other places. And there's a variety of reasons for why that's the case, but it does sort of, it forces perspective upon you. And I think what a lot of what Karsa is experiencing in his journey is a widening of that perspective, hitting him again and again and again, which forces him to replace himself where he is in the world. And that seems to be an ongoing thing for Karsa.
Have you been? Oh, I'm sorry, Layla. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that reminds me. I think that's an ongoing thing for several of the characters. The characters where their names change. I see that as it as they either find new skills, find new gods, something about their identity changes. And so their names change. And I actually made that connection because I was, I'm doing an oral history on something else. And, long story short, someone I was interviewing who's, about 10, 15 years older than me, I'm 59. She was like, identity is fluid. And I came into, as I started thinking about the characters in this series, I started seeing it the same way, that as something becomes more important or as something happens to them, something about their identity changes. And they retain some, but they become something new at the same time. And so I just really dig that. And I think it reflects reality, is what I'm trying to say. It's fantasy, but it reflects a psychological reality.
It's probably the impetus for many people sort of moving from their hometown into a city.
Mhm.
They then have the opportunity to reinvent themselves.
Mm.
And I had no choice in that matter. When I was growing up, it was for family reasons. It was very, very dysfunctional and poor, and I ended up in a different school virtually every year.
Mhm.
And initially, that I suppose there was trauma involved in that, dislocation, that kind of sense. But it didn't take long, I think, before I realized that each time I come to a new place, I can redefine myself because
Mm.
nobody else knows me. So I became a bit of a chameleon in that respect, and I just sort of explored different approaches to what seemed to be a repetition of scenarios where I would show up, and within the first, let's face it, this is back in the '60s, so the first week of school at recess, I'd be in a fight, and you're the new kid, so the pecking order needs to be established, and so that was happening. No matter how I redefine myself, that fight was coming. So I do recall, I think by about the fifth or sixth grade, I was learning to fight very dirty and winning those fights. Um, and that just sort of, you realize that even at the time, it repositioned me in the entire classroom or community or year. And and that was really eye-opening in many respects. So yeah, it's how characters engage with the reality that they're in, and how that reality changes them. I mean, it would be difficult to have, and it happens in a lot of fantasy fictions where you've got heroic characters who are effectively unchanged by anything that happens around them and to them. And I found that very frustrating. That didn't seem realistic to me. That changes were going to occur, and some of them are going to be traumatic, and that trauma is actually going to have a long lasting effect on that character. So yeah, I'm much more interested in how we engage with the real world, and how that world impacts us,
Mhm.
and we're in constant motion, and our place in it is constantly changing. And sometimes we can direct that, we can choose that, and other times it's just how events turn out.
Yeah.
Well, I've lived in a couple of different countries, and I can definitely
Mm.
attest to each time being an opportunity to sort of reinvent myself or present a different side of myself to the people I would meet there. But it's also interesting how different people sort of bring out different things of you,
Mm.
and how you kind of become a different person with different people around. And it's also, and then it's interesting when you then go back to some of the people you met, you know, 5, 10 years ago, and sometimes it's like you almost immediately switch to that person that you were with them
Mhm.
when you knew them. Sometimes that doesn't work, but it's a really interesting phenomena. You can be sort of a different person, different times, but also just with different people.
Yeah, and it's
True.
almost a universal theme of storytelling where, um, the older person comes back into their family. They've been estranged from the family, and they come back into the family, and the expectations all around them want to slot them back into the old grooves that existed in the relationship of siblings and parents and all the rest. But you've changed by that point, right? So you don't fit anymore where they expect you to fit. And so, plenty of films and stories are all about that kind of conflict. And there's the expectation of sort of being where you always were, relationship wise, with your siblings or your parents, and that no longer being the case.
Mhm.
And, yeah, absolutely, it's interesting stuff.
I think I most strongly felt that in this book with Absalar, when
Hmm.
she makes this journey to. I mean, it starts in Dead House Case, but she makes this journey to go back to Itkokan, to the village where she was born, where she grew up, and then she sort of realizes that she's not the fishy girl that she was when she left, and there's not really a place for her.
Yeah.
She has to go out and do something else with her life because she can't stay there anymore. She can't stay there as the assassin ascendant that she is now.
No, and I think themes of dislocation are certainly, prevalent throughout the series. Many characters have to deal with that. Fiddler's heading for it as you read further in Strings.
Mhm.
A couple of comments. Our friend Johanna's here. Excited to watch this.
Oh, hi,
Excited
Joanna.
for the second book in the Witness trilogy. And Mr. Erikson's familiar green room.
I inherited it. We just haven't gotten around to painting it. So,
And our friend Daniel's here.
Cool.
Matt, Karsa feels to me like the character who develops the most throughout the series.
well, given where he starts and the fact that as a reader you come into him very early on in his creation, that I would agree that's a pretty huge arc on his part.
Mhm.
And he became fun to write with because I could throw everything at him and just see what would happen, right? And so he goes through a lot.
Yeah, you threw a couple of sharks at him.
Yep.
I love Carson. I want to talk more about him here in a second, but DK Moon mentioned the longer single POV adds to my reading enjoyment.
That's
Is
good.
that-
I mean, it's intended to be as immersive as possible. So, and I held to, even if I look back on that section, I held to the tightest point of view I possibly could. So, his misunderstandings of, his companions is something I really wanted to hold on to, so that, if Bainisk or was it Bainisk? Who are the two guys with him? Can't remember their names.
Bayroth and Delum.
Bayroth and Delum Thord. They have a conversation that Karsa is listening in on. He may either misunderstand it or not understand it at all, but the reader does. So there's that kind of extra engagement for the readership, I think.
And our friend Matt had a question. A lot of characters die in the books, but a lot of these don't stay dead. What are your thoughts on death in your books?
Well, it's the world building, basically the structural premises that are underlying the Malayan world is very much inspired by a lot of ancient belief systems, including, for example, the Greeks, where they had plenty of myths about traveling into the realm of death and returning or not returning. And then the Egyptian, of course, the Greeks got a lot of their inspiration from Egypt. And so there's that kind of crossover. And it just struck us when we were gaming that it gave us greater flexibility to actually, it's one thing to explore the theme of death only from the side of the living. I mean, that's only half of the equation. And so you run up against that wall immediately of the end of mortality. And, if our modern world and the West sort of views that as the end, then there really is nothing to discuss, right? But I'm not one who naturally ascribes to that anyway. So the idea of exploring death from both sides just seemed to be an obvious opportunity within a fantasy setting. And of course, we've got a god of death. Well, what's the god up to? Is he just simply harvesting souls, or is he, what's his state of mind after all this, all this time? And of course, the deaths where characters return, they're not the same person. They have undergone, major transformation of their psyche, and there's trauma involved, and there's sort of an opening of the eyes. I mean, I don't know. Go onto YouTube and start listening to people discussing near-death experience, and you'll see the extent to which even being dead for 30 seconds or 6 minutes has fundamentally changed every single one of them. and you can rationalize it as this was just the flare out of oxygen starved brain or whatever belief system you want to sort of put into place there. None of that matters to the person. The person is changed. It's as simple as that. And so in the Malayan stuff, I definitely get interested and get more interested in the character when I'm pushing them back out of their state of death and back into the world of the living, because then they really start getting fascinating for me.
I found that theme fascinating on another level in regard to, history, where, there are voices that we've heard 2,000 years ago, for example, that are still present and still impacting our world today. And so that fits, I guess thematically that fits with kind of a perception I have anyway, that, nothing ever really goes away. Things rise up again, but new old texts are discovered and the voice is back in, into the world. And so I kind of had a sense, that's the sense I'm going with as I'm reading. So it kind of helps to hear your perspective on that too.
Well, I mean, you consider one of the earliest stories ever that we know of anyways, Gilgamesh. It's all about that, right? It's all about that journey.
Right.
So if we think of those early stories, Gilgamesh, a lot of the Greek myths, Egyptian myths, if you look at it from sort of a modern perspective, you might call them all epic fantasy. They are, the origins of literature is found in epic fantasy. So it's certainly themes that have been explored and will be constantly explored throughout our existence. And so for me, how could you avoid it? Why would you avoid it? It's a central question of what it is to be human, is think about, what happens afterwards? Where does our consciousness go? How does the experience of dying potentially either change us, transform us, or end us? Whichever view you want to take on these things. But they're questions worth asking, even though if we don't have answers, but they're certainly worth asking.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I was already very emotional at the end of The Chain of Dogs. But reading about Duiker coming back to life was probably even more saddening. Knowing, reading the end of Dead House Gates, and sort of, despite all the horror, like at least having this comfort that finally he is getting his peace, and then watching him come back into all this horror of the world, that really impacted me.
Well, he comes back a broken man, doesn't he? And I can tell you that his story is to some extent picked up again, at least briefly, in Toll the Hounds. So I haven't put him away completely by this point. So
not there yet, but
yeah.
Hopefully next year.
With Karsa, well, with that storyline, especially in the first book in this book in House of Chains, I'm not sure if I just didn't get the humor before, because when we would discuss the books, like the first couple of books, everyone else was laughing about certain parts of it. I didn't catch the humor, but I don't know if it was me or if it was something that you ramped up the humor a little bit, but a lot of the dialogue and the back and forth, there was some great humorous portions in that first part.
Do you mean with respect to the army and the military?
Just the bit with Karsa and the dialogue in the beginning in the first book.
Like
I
Carson,
felt like I cut onto it.
like when Carson.
Go ahead.
No, just like when Karsa was telling Torvald Nom, you talk too much or you use too many words. That's a good one. Yeah.
I mean, some of the time, I'm hoping it's clear that a lot of the humor is flying over Karsa's head. So yeah, there's more opportunity in that respect.
Right.
He's unintentionally funny, that's for sure.
Yeah.
You know, I found humor too, as I said before, with Anrak and Troll Singer. When they first met, I kind of saw them as like now they're on this road trip, you know, like Martin and Lewis on their road trip, you know, because when they get to the hounds, the dogs, and you know, Troll Singer basically dares Anrak to let them go, and so you know, there's a lot of stuff happening there. It's not all serious. Uh, it's humor, but it also humanizes them, even though Anrak is, you know, I guess neither are human, right?
Mm.
But it makes them more appealing as characters, I think, to see that side of them.
Yeah, and certainly that's one aspect of using character-based humor in a narrative is yeah, to draw that sort of humanizing element a bit more to the fore, so that people can't be serious all the time. It actually gets kind of boring if a character is, you know, perpetually serious.
Yeah.
And if you end up with a character, writing a character like that, then you can have just absolute hilarity going on around them, and they're just, you know, unfazed by it or unaffected by it. I think in House of Chains, there's certainly Feridan Sort, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I think with the Scorpions, is that in this book?
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a completely humorless character, right? And so
Yeah.
she has an impact in her own fashion.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the Thais Liu San are also another wonderful example of that. I don't hear people talk about them much, but I found them absolutely hilarious. From the first moment they meet Troll and they're like, "Oh, would you like to be our slave?" To the point where I think their horses get blown up at the end by the Morth munition. They're like,
Yeah,
"Well,
probably.
maybe we'll just abandon this adventure because it's not worth
Yeah.
that's not worth our time. Let's focus on other things." I thought they were hilarious. I had real fun with them.
Cool.
Yeah. And you know, there's drier humor. Even Tavari, I'm not sure if at the end where Karsa says, "You're not my enemy anymore," and she kind of dryly says, "Oh, that's good to know," you know.
Well, but the reader knows that it really is good to know, right?
Right.
Laura is not aware of that.
Right.
So yeah, her comment is certainly intended ironically, but the reader should know better, right? So
Right. The reader knows.
yeah.
So, but that, you know, that reminds me of something that Steve and I talked about last time too, which is the military itself. I guess what led you to set your series within, you know, within the military and the soldiers on the ground versus the, you know, the leaders and the plotters, which of course are in there too. But
Yeah, well, to a lesser extent. I think both Esselmont, Cam, and I were even in our gaming book that preceded all of this. We were all about sort of unplugging the more cliched elements of epic fantasy. So, you know, in creating the Malazan world, we pushed it back to sort of late Roman Empire as opposed to medieval Europe, and we were much more interested, as you say, on the boots on the ground. Gardens of the Moon certainly pushed that quite a bit with Crocus and his impact on the story. So that was a trope we always wanted to kick at, and that idea of entire novels all about the aristocracy or the nobility. We were kind of by that point fairly tired of that stuff, and that combined with two things. One, reading a lot of Vietnam War literature and military stuff. And then seeing what Glenn Cook was doing with that, with his Black Company series, was, you know, I mean, he's the one who sort of laid the groundwork and sort of broke the mold of fantasy by basically infusing a fantasy setting with a Vietnam War veteran mentality. I mean, it was fantastic, absolutely amazing. And then both Cam and I have worked on digs and, you know, in archaeology, and quite often very remote locations. And usually a small crew, you know, 7, 8 people. And one of the things you discover fairly quickly when you're out in the bush on a dig is sort of the civilized trappings kind of slip away from everybody. And you get to know people in a way that you would never be able to get to know them if you'd met them in a city or in a classroom or anything like that. It's a whole different beast out there. And at times, you know, environmental conditions or badly run projects, there's a level of absurdity that slips in. And either you laugh or you go crazy. And so both Cam and I, we tended to head towards going for laughs. You know, no matter how miserable things were, we could always find something to laugh about. And so that kind of attitude, I guess, we wanted to make sure was reflected in these soldiers who are, you know, are being put through all of these experiences, good and bad, boring and terrifying, and all of these things at once. And humor and understatement being the means by which they defend their own humanity, if that makes sense.
It does. And that, you know, we had even mentioned Vietnam last time. And, you know, I remember myself just being from Texas, you know, friends and you know, their relatives who had come back from Vietnam, and then the literature, as you said, too. And then now we've gone into 1991 and the first Gulf War and all of that. So I guess my point really is about fantasy, contemporary fantasy, and how it relates to those life experiences, especially of writers. You know, for example, Wheel of Time, the author was a Vietnam veteran, Robert Jordan, and PTSD was a focus, you know. And so as I'm reading this, as I'm reading your series, that kept coming back to me. What was that Vietnam experience, and then the experiences forward. So it seems like it's fantasy, but there's a lot of reality to consider, I guess.
Well, I hope so. Curiously, that ties into what we talked about earlier with the notion of returning. So I brought the idea of you being away from, you know, estranged from your family for 20 years and going back to the hometown, the small town, and the expectations that are laid upon you, and this almost pressure to fall back into the familiar patterns that were there when you were much younger. Well, you know, times that by 1,000 for a returning veteran, right? The world they've just left is so fundamentally different from what they left behind. And then when they're expected to return and just seamlessly slip back into the, you know, that mindset and that way of living, and to fit with a, well, more or less functioning society, when they've been, you know, spending the last 3 years or 2 years in a broken, non-functional, dysfunctional society, where conflicts everywhere around you. That's the sort of, I think, the thing that is the most tragic to all of this. And I certainly never wanted to gloss over it or be dismissive of it. So yeah, it plays a role. It plays a role. And also the notion that when you're in the military, you build your families around you. And again, it's not a question of going to a university and meeting up with like-minded people and suddenly, yeah, you guys are all sort of hanging out together and you know, you've built a family. It's an artificial family, but you built it, right? Of friends. That's not how squads are put together, right? You know, it can be anybody and everybody. So again, it's an unnatural grouping, and then it becomes a challenge to every person in that group. You know, how do you live together, and how do you manage those very disparate experiences, life experiences that each person is bringing to that scenario. And this is what a lot of the writers of military fiction who have been veterans are focusing on, and it's what they're exploring. One of the best writers for that is Gustav Hasford with his book, The Short Timers, which became Full Metal Jacket, Kubrick's adaptation of the book. It's as far as I know, it is okay. Going After Cacciato is a Mobius strip story, so there's magic realism involved. But I think The Short Timers is maybe the only absolutely pure, raw Vietnam War novel that has fantasy in it. It has one of the most extraordinary scenes that, for some reason, Kubrick never included in the film. But it's a fantastic scene, and it's surreal, and it's just wonderful. So all of that stuff sort of, I guess, feeds into the way that, especially since Cam and I were on digs and on digs together and different digs. So when we were gaming, we'd fall back into that sheer level of, I guess, absurdity in terms of role playing the characters. So that humor always comes through, I think. At least for us, it did.
Well, as you said, the Malazan books certainly do focus a lot on the sort of this common soldier, the foot on the ground. But I also find in this book in particular, there is a lot of focus on leadership or and people coming into positions where they have to be leaders. Thinking of Devore, Tamil, who are sort of stepping in to replace Coltane, who is this like symbol of a perfect, all-knowing leader. So I was wondering if that was something that we were exploring here.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's interesting that it still ties into that notion of positioning within a family, right? I mean, Memories of Ice is in one respect, if I really simplify it, it's primarily about motherhood, and so you have sort of mother roles are being played out throughout the entire book, starting in the prologue. This one's about siblings, and so your two primary movers and shakers for the story are sisters, and yet they are estranged from one another, and at least for one of them is a complete stranger to the other. And so it's kind of recognizing that family dynamic is the dynamic of human interaction. It doesn't matter whether it's in the military or anywhere else. And so leaders acquire a kind of a parental role, whether they accept it or not. And Strings, of course, Fiddler is finding himself being pushed into that role, one that he certainly didn't have with the Bridge Burners. So you're going to be able to see his development of becoming a leader, even though he never moves up in rank, but he's still where all eyes turn to at times of need. So yeah, that kind of relationship is and it's going to be played out over and over again amongst all kinds of characters, that there is a familial aspect to all of this that hopefully is recognizable, at least instinctively, to the reader.
Yeah, and I also appreciate that not everyone is necessarily able to cope with that new role that they are given. You have Tabor, who is seemingly becoming this good leader. Felison, probably not so much, but there's also Gamut the Fist, who is sort of forced into this position by Tabor, and at the end just can really live up to those to what's required of him. Like, he's not able to make that transition from being just a soldier to being a leader.
Yeah.
I got another thought as I was reading about Tavor and Felison at the end. Tavor, she controls her emotions, and Felison was all emotion.
Yeah.
And by killing Felison unknowingly, that sort of communicated that sense of shutting down emotion once again. And I thought that was interesting that now we have Felison Younger, who may be inheriting something of Felison, her mother, in terms of she's been also brutally harmed, and so will she seek vengeance, or how will she direct her emotions in the future? And it seems I'm still trying to figure out Crocus or Cutter's role in what working with Felison Younger, but I sense something about that. We're heading towards something to do with how emotion plays a role in our lives, and how it's helpful and harmful at the same time.
Yeah, I would, to some extent, but I would only advise you not to be deceived by the surface appearance. So one able to constrain any outward display of emotion is not necessarily an emotionless person.
Right.
So everything's down to perception in this case. And Tavor, as a leader, at least her self-definition of what it is to be a leader is to not show emotion. So that's why there's this talk about cold iron versus hot iron and that kind of thing. So that is the task that she has assumed, and whether or not she can hold on to it for as long as necessary is one of her main challenges in the series.
And we know that she loved Felison, because she did send Pearl and Lostera out to find them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I just say, the chemistry between Pearl and Lostara is perfect.
Right.
I think sometimes the romance in these books get a bit of a bad reputation, but I think this one is done so well, and I had so much fun with it too. And I always looked forward to seeing them again.
Well, and I've said this before, but a lot of the banter is actually almost copied verbatim from conversations my wife and I would have. So it fit well enough. I mean, neither of us are assassins, but apart from that, a lot of those lines that were dropped there, I just sort of plucked from memory. Yeah.
They feel very lived. They feel very real.
Good.
We did have a comment from Vignesh. Coltrane is the most impactful character for me in the series as of now, but so see the characters trace back to his travel in this book was a wonderful look back on trauma and war.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to physically move those characters, and I don't think this is a big spoiler, but Tabor's army becomes the Bone Hunters. That's the name they acquire. And so, if you look at the rest of the series, you can see that there's a whole book called The Bone Hunters. So I stay with them. But returning that on that route allowed me to actually kind of re-explore the legacy of the journey. But also it's part of the birth of the Bone Hunters, and they're basically on their way physically to a place that is kind of thematically a match to the Bridge Burners. So if you think of the Bridge Burners from Gardens of the Moon and Memories of Ice, they're in their last sort of days of existence as a military force, which is kind of strange to start a series that way with the last days of sort of your main military focus for the Malayan Empire. But I knew that if I started with the end of the Bridge Burners, then I could start with the beginning of the Bone Hunters. And so you'd get the full package. So this is their journey. And of course, they're journeying through recent past and recent events and seeing just the rubbish left behind, the wreckage left behind by that. And that's kind of it's a physical metaphor for their answering the rebellion itself. And that's why they're there. So retracing the steps made sense.
Go ahead, Layla.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to mention Eric had a comment. Near-death experiences may be tied to prophetic visions.
They may well be. Hard to know.
And Matt, speaking of being emotional after Dead House Gates, why are you so mean to us, Mr. Erikson?
I think it was in the writing of Dead House Gates, I realized that I was less putting tragic elements into fantasy than fantasy elements into tragedy, because it suddenly struck me that actually I want to write tragedies. So because I was interested in the notion of catharsis, and that pushed me in that direction. But I knew what sort of Coltane's fate was going to be, and it was just a question of keeping the reins, tight, but not letting the horse take off on us. Because, and a lot of people complain about the Chain of Dogs being this slog. Well, it's intended to be a slog. That's the whole point. And without it, you don't get the emotional payoff. At least in my mind, you have to actually go with them almost every step of the way to really have the response that I'm hoping the reader has when they get to the fall at the end of Dead House Gates.
I certainly did.
Good.
I truly did not see it as a slog. I enjoyed those parts. I felt very comfortable in them. I felt like I was getting more information about the characters and the nuances between each one. And that's what made it such a beautiful, tragic ending, is because realizing all that had built up and, how it came to an end. A question I do have, I haven't quite figured out, is I forget the name of the person who ultimately shot Coltane. It starts with an S.
Squint.
Squint. He seems to have been accepted back into the fold, if I understand correctly. He's not ostracized by...
Is there a point of view from Squint in House of Chains? I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Yeah, wait for it. Because, there may be a sense that he's accepted, but he doesn't see it that way.
Okay.
No, absolutely not. There's a conversation coming. Don't worry.
Okay. All right, good, because I've been worried about him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Eric had a comment. Loved your intro to the Black Company.
Is that a written one? Was that for the? If you can answer me, Eric. I wrote an intro for the Black Company for a kind of Masterworks kind of series. And if that's what you're referring to, can you let me know, Eric? Because I would appreciate that. Because I've just been asked by another publishing house to write a foreword to the Black Company. And I wasn't aware whether the one I've already written has been published or not. Recent edition is on the store. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. That means I have to write another foreword to the Black Company for a different publisher. Okay.
And I also had a question: was the Malayan Empire being more of a meritocracy, regardless of where they're from in the empire, in comparison to Lothar and exploration, or more an ideal society?
To some extent, yeah. We certainly wanted. There was a period in Byzantine history when Constantinople was probably the most tolerant and diverse civilization anywhere, certainly as a city, and nobody really cared what people's skin color was. Nobody cared about what nation you came from, what language you spoke, even. And it was a brief period before sort of, I guess, religion sort of reared its head in terms of Islam, and I don't want to get into all that because that's actually about the Crusades more than it is about Byzantium. But there was a period there, and I remember when I was studying that stuff being really taken by that. And then for the world building, yeah, we very much wanted we wanted a world that really did not have that kind of racism in place, and did not have patriarchy either. So by stripping those two things away, that helped us build the cultures and the civilizations of the Malayan world. Now, when I got to Lether is very much about, in terms of inspiration, the British Empire. And that's what I built it on. And so it was built as a counterpoint, certainly, to the Malaysians. Yeah.
Well, speaking of empires, I had a question about the rebellion. So when I read Dead House Gates, and most of it is told from the point of view of the Chain of Dogs or of the Malaysians, and you sort of get the idea that the armies of the apocalypse, like they are doing, like they're committing a lot of very violent acts and just not treating even their own people nicely. But there's still this sense that these are people rebelling against a colonizing power,
Absolutely.
power that conquered, that basically is engaged in a military conquest of the place where they live. So it's very interesting to me then go to House of Chains and learn more about the camp of the apocalypse, and see how basically all of the leadership is completely corrupted, does not seem to care about the cause at all, and only seems to pursue their own interests. So I was wondering if like this was your this is how you view rebellions in general.
No, not particularly. For the case of the whirlwind, the influence of the godlike powers, like Shaikh, and I think you find out in this one where Shaikh came from. I'm not sure if you do, but I think you do.
Yeah.
Had a profound sort of knock-on effect onto how the core leaders of that rebellion end up basically devouring themselves. So that kind of was an overriding influencer in terms of how I wrote out the camp in Rariku. But in a more general sense, the emergence of violence on that level, on that scale, is kind of it doesn't have focus, so it tends to be destructive of even things that needn't have been destroyed, if you know what I mean. And so social structure breaks down very quickly, and the equivalent of the people with the most guns tend to step into the vacuum of power, and bad things can happen at that point. Which is not to say that rebelling against a colonial power is in any way something I want to be commenting on. I mean, it's part of history, and we've seen it played out many times. And liberation takes many forms, and quite often it's not an easy transition either. So it's very much sort of recognizing that this isn't a black and white argument, you know, colonialism and imperialism, and it's complicated. And so I want to stay within that complications, right? I'm not sort of presenting any particular thesis on this kind of stuff. I'm simply trying to explore how people are living within that. And so there will be examples on all sides. At least I hope so. Anyways, I don't know if that was an answer or not, but
something I think when I think of the whirlwind in general is it's you know, it's grown out of a need for it's grown out of pain. It's grown out of a need for vengeance. I'm not sure, but it's definitely something that's grown out of pain from you know, Anrak and his wife, and so I saw it more as drawing in all of these wounded people as well, you know, and maybe that's where I've got a little bit of confusion, because the House of Chains also seems to draw in people who have, you know, issues like Karsa and Hiboric, I believe. So I guess, does a whirlwind and the House of Chains have a connection? I guess that's the question I'm getting at.
You mean the specific House of Chains?
Yes.
No, probably only geographically, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I can't think in other respects. But I also wanted to sort of explore the idea that the land itself is a major player in all of this, and those forces, when they're triggered, they're kind of they don't discriminate in terms of their victims, and so that aspect of I'm trying to think, is the House of Chains involving the rebirth of Rariku, or is that Bone Hunters?
I think is the rebirth when the water comes in?
Yeah, that's House of Chains. Okay,
That's
good.
House of Chains. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was dancing around that trying to remember whether it showed up in Bone Hunters or not. So yes, so the land responds. And if one takes a huge step back, you can see there's a healing consequence to that, which is, I guess, also a cultural healing as well. So there's all those things are sort of in play. But one of the things that happens in these circumstances is because colonialism and conquest, imperial conquest, replaces the power structure and the power dynamics of the conquered society. And so there will be elements within that society that will resist that for obvious reasons, because they've lost their power. And so if those elements can then incite the general populace into rebellion, then they've got a proper rebellion on their hands, and they might well oust the occupiers. But of course, historically, we know that even when that's done, you still can't go back to how it used to be, right? Things have changed. Everything changes. And so that sense of that constant evolution of society and culture is always going to be part of these stories and part of the themes I'm approaching, because cultures in conflict are, at least for me, historically interesting and emotionally interesting as well.
All right. Brian had a question. Was there a particular inspiration for the image of a cruciform dragon? It's been years, but that passage has remained with me. I suppose it's a bit of a Cadiz like, but I am a humanities dullard.
Caracas, I don't know. I don't think so. I write visually, so I just sort of built the scene. And of course, you know, having read, if you've read Dead House Gates, you know that there is, I am exploring some Judeo-Christian imagery as well, already in place. And so if on occasion I sort of ring that bell again, then, you know, that's why I'm doing that. But I can't remember how I described it, but yeah, it was probably pretty detailed anyways.
Yeah, Matt commented, reading the chain of dogs wasn't a slog. It was a witness, and it was witnessing a heartbreaking slog.
And the thing is, I mean, there's a running joke running all the way through it with respect to Mincer, the leader of the sappers. And of course, holding off on that as long as I possibly could was, at least for me, a lot of the fun of the writing of it. That you couldn't find him. He never showed up in the officers' meetings and all the rest. And initially that was accidental. I just accidentally I forgot about him and dropped him out of there. And then I realized that, no, I can work that and turn it into one particular scene where you know, where everything gets reversed, and it allows that moment of humanity to show in Coltane. So you know, you were talking earlier about Tavor's basically raising that wall around herself in terms of emotional. Well, we already saw it in Coltane, didn't we? And so if she's looking for an inspiration, maybe she's drawing on that sense of Coltane as a leader. But of course, that's the moment of humanizing moment for him. Is the whole scene with the demotion of rank. Yeah.
And I also had a question. Is it true that the Chains of Dogs is in part based on the flight of the Nez Perce?
Yeah. But also the retreat through Afghanistan to the Khyber Pass by the British when they were kicked out the first time.
One scene for me that stood out, I started to wonder if it was something wrong with me, but the way Karsa dispatches Bidenthal was especially satisfying. I thought it was great, but in hearing other perspectives on it, I'd heard and read some other perspectives that it was a little bit, we shouldn't just kill a character like Bidenthal. He should be punished in other ways. What are your thoughts on that, on scenes like that, on you know, death versus other types of punishment for characters?
I didn't have to worry about it too much because I knew it was going to be Karsa. It couldn't be the Malazans for all kinds of reasons. It was not their punishment to meet. But Karsa as an outside agency that represents a fairly almost simplified sense of justice, almost eye for eye kind of thing. And so, you know, symbolically, the gesture he makes in killing Bidenthal is in perfect keeping with the crimes that Bidenthal committed. And as far as Carson was concerned, that was good enough. And I was happy to leave it with that. And rather than explore sort of other aspects of what constitutes punishment. I allowed Karsa to be fairly direct, and it's fitting. It fits his character, and it suits his character, and it seemed appropriate.
And you know, there's something about that whole setting I really enjoy. You know, in the midst of everyone else's aspirations, for power, or, everything that's going on. Here comes Karsa in the middle of it, to take care of his business.
Mhm.
And I just love stuff like that where, it's not just about the two big, armies clashing. There are all these other motives and individuals with their own motives, acting. And so I really, I thought that was, that whole thing was good.
For me, he was going to. I was setting all this stuff up in the camp, but I knew that Karsa was going to be the bull in the china shop. And once he
Yeah.
got back, that was
Yeah,
the idea.
I felt maybe a little bit differently about Bidethal's death. I know people get very excited about it, but I guess I'm not a big fan of retributive justice. Not. I mean, obviously, not that I approve or agree with the things he does, but I think more than anything, his death just made me really sad because I felt like, okay, he's dead, but it doesn't erase anything that
Doesn't erase a thing.
you've done. It's not going to fix Fellison. So I didn't really see the point of taking pleasure in him dying.
And I certainly didn't. I didn't write it for purposes of taking pleasure in his dying. This was consistent to how Karsa would respond to this situation. So that's basically his tribal law being enacted there. And so it's done, right? It's like, the legacy and the damage that Bidethal caused is not something I'm going to leave alone. I'm staying with it, and we're going to see the victims have to deal with, the damage that they've received, and it's like anything else. If you're going to create something like that in fiction, it's not the event, and it's not even the acts or the crimes that are something you should be indulging in. You just lay that stuff out in as simple a language as possible, as in a repertorial style, so no emotion attached. But it's the consequences that's where you have to sort of allow, as the writer, you allow your own emotions to actually, or rather to allow what that character might be experiencing, and through your imagination, this is the only way we can do this, to seep into your mindset. And at that point, then, you are in that character's skin, and you have to be honest when you're there, and you have to be compassionate. And that's the stuff that I want to write towards. It's not, the action scenes they all have a particular plot function and all the rest. But it's the characters that are my primary interest.
I kind of like the randomness of it in terms that, there's a lot of people out there that have done bad. They don't always, get the punishment that should happen. But yet, sometimes people end up getting punished, and it's not even for what they really should be punished for, if that makes sense, And so I kind of got that random sense of, Karsa had his own reasons for what he was doing, and it just happened to mesh with, being with this guy that's just like a really horrible person.
Yeah, and of course it's not an easy fit, is it? Because his timing sucked. He was too late in many respects. Right, the damage was already done. So it's not an easy fit at all, and that felt more realistic in a sense, rather than showing up in the nick of time kind of thing.
And then even as we're talking about that, that particular circumcision is actually a cultural attribute of some cultures. So, while we're seeing it as a moral issue, other cultures and other times, and even now, might not see it the same way. Like, why was Bidethal killed? Because, hey,
Yeah.
this is a cultural practice, So
Yeah, and it's I mean, I studied anthropology, and so at the time, at least, and maybe to this day, there's always this issue of cultural relativism and moral relativism. Where do you draw the line? What traditional practices are actually pushing beyond what is morally acceptable in a more general sense? And of course, we've got a Human Rights Commission. We've got Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the rest. And if that runs up against something like female circumcision, then you'll see arguments on both sides. That this is what's a cultural practice, traditional practice, or whatever. But at least for me, at some point, a moral line is crossed, and that was sort of my take on it. That I'm not one who would automatically default to revering or respecting tradition. A lot of traditions they really sucked. They were bad. It's as simple as that. And so that notion of cultural purity, which is the counterpoint of the whole thing, right? Because if you're talking about cultural relativism in terms of what most people would consider inhuman practices, then the other side is, what are you defending? You're defending a kind of cultural purity. But cultures are not solid things. They're constantly changing, and they are evolving, and they are appropriating from other cultures on a regular basis. They are on occasion expropriating from other cultures. So they're in a constant state of flux and evolution. And quite often, the appeal to cultural purity is actually an appeal to nostalgia. It's how a person remembers themselves growing up within that culture. And of course, it's not the same culture anymore, right? It changes, it morphs, it changes all the time. So then you're looking at issues of cultural identity, and that's a whole different area. But it's complicated. It is very complicated stuff.
Yeah, that's why that scene, that scene invites deep thoughts.
Well, and that's probably why I chose Karsa, because you can end up going down sort of a rabbit hole in terms of ethics and cultural respect of other cultures and all the rest. And I just did not want to go there. So I sent Carson a hammer, and he just smashed it all up. He's useful that way.
I think I can definitely see you taking a stance there, because my experience in most of the characters in Alassin, especially the characters that would be considered the bad guys, has been that even people who seem evil or have bad intentions at first sight. I'm thinking maybe someone like Lasine or Taishran. Like, over time, as you get to know them, you realize there may be a different side to them, or they may have good reasons for why they're doing what they're doing. But I really struggle to find something good in Bidethal.
Yeah, and it's one of the instances where I guess I actually did come down pretty heavily on one side of the subject. Yeah, I try to avoid it as much as possible, but that was certainly one instance where I guess my horror and revulsion that this particular practice is continuing to this day got to me.
Vignesh had a question. Do we see the new Coltane and his development anytime in the bigger Malazan series?
You'd have to read some of Eslamont, I think, to get an idea of that.
Matt says the Mincer joke payoff was so worth it.
Man, I mean, that was, holding the punchline that long was just so much fun.
Every drop of Chain of Dogs humor was a desperately needed
Yeah.
break.
Yeah, and if there had been too much, it would not have had the same impact. It had to be quite stingy in that area.
And you get a peek at Hood, Eric commented. From Matt, Benethal, desperately needed to be Karsa. Could you please introduce Karsa to Malik Rowell?
Oh, you're being so mean to Malik. Okay.
Austin, our friend Austin's here. I tried to wear spoilers, but I can't help but be here for the wisdom of Mr. Erikson.
No,
Steve
cool.
isn't
Thank
okay.
you. I don't see myself as being particularly wise, so.
Karsa's going to Karsa.
No, that's an interesting statement. That it's an indication then that there's a consistency to Karsa that the reader gets and the reader understands. So I take that as a huge compliment. So much appreciated.
Had a comment from Nilfrog. Thank you, Nilfrog. Hi, folks. Thoughts on this particular theme? It's not the gods that are important. It is the sleeping outside of oneself that gifts a moral with virtue.
That sounds like a quote from somewhere, doesn't it?
It does.
You'll have to ascribe that one, Nilfrog.
And thank you for the comment and for the super chat. Our friend Daniel, there is so much going on in a spoiler Malazan is less than the spoilers you see in a movie preview. Yeah, there's a lot, yeah. And our friend AP is here, Malik Rowell the Merciful, just a misunderstood puppy.
Yeah, AP would say that. Yeah.
I have another rabbit hole topic to ask about that I've been thinking about a lot, which is Crocus, who is an Alcutter. Was he once allied with Opan, or was it the same relationship? Okay.
Yeah, no alliance there at all. I mean, you'd be foolish to ever ally with that particular twin god, for sure.
And then speaking of that, this is where my rabbit hole starts, because they are Opan. There's two sides. The lady who brings positive luck, and the Lord who brings not so positive luck or negative. And so they're working together. But they're, it can't be chance if they're making the decision on what's going to happen. But then if they're constantly fighting, then they're built on emotion. So we're back to emotion again. That emotion, does emotion guide luck or chance? And so I've been wrestling with this whole idea, and if it relates to Crocus, but now maybe, I don't know, I'm just sensing that, first there was Opan, now there's Cotillion. Neither is directly influencing Crocus, but they still have had an important impact on him. Excuse me. Yeah. So I guess my main rabbit hole is, when is it luck and when is it just the whim of the lady or the Lord?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, the lady or the Lord would certainly be very happy to lay claim for virtually anything and everything that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And just as one character may be pulled away from something bad, another character is pushed into it. So they're at work everywhere. In terms of their role, it's already diminishing in the series, and they become less relevant. Okay. Someone else takes over that role in many respects, whom you will end up knowing as the errant. And it's more I guess a question of notions of fate and what is fated and what isn't. and cause and effect and these kind of things. So I guess in a way they personify the chaotic nature of the universe. It can go either way at any time. So.
I love that.
Oh, is it? All right. Right. Was that the beginning of a chapter? I don't remember it at all.
I'm trying to remember.
Right. Okay. So I wrote that, did I? See what I mean? I mean, I don't know. Who was that guy? Who wrote that stuff? It's not me anymore.
Well, there are certainly several gods or groups of gods in this book who seem to rule under false pretenses. I guess the seven would be the most obvious example. And there's this sort of like, in discussion about what a god's role should be. Should there be sort of trying to take care of the people who are dedicated to them, or is it okay if they're just extracting services from them as the seven are doing? I'm also thinking about Osric, who is seemingly the god of the Taisleosan, but somehow seems okay with just having someone else do all the work for him.
Yeah. The relationship between that which is worshipped and the worshippers is going to be explored throughout the entire series for sure. Okay, so Niferog's telling me that it's one of the Jade Souls talking to Haborg. Yeah, those conversations, those were interesting. Those were sort of this world intrusions into the Malazan world. Maybe I'm giving too much away there, but and I can't tell you if I'm actually quoting anybody else. I don't think so, but I may be quoting a particular philosophical position that I may have read somewhere here in this world.
The jade statues are some of the weirdest things that I've encountered in Malazan so far. Like after reading 6 of these books, I'm still so like it's so out there that I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, that sort of almost disembodied arguments that were going on. Thinking back, I was probably reading some of Ian M. Banks' culture novels at the time, and of course the AI ships have conversations like that all the time. So maybe there was an influence there.
JD Racing commented, HOS really explored the daily life of a soldier without a battle. Enjoyed the humor.
Great. Cool.
Mm-hmm. And something that Layla and I talked about last time, I believe it was either the first video or the second, about the women soldiers and the men soldiers being, oftentimes you forget what their genders are. So I really like that. There was something that we talked about in the last discussion. Is that was I really like those characters that you forget whether they're men or women.
Well, I mean, often I forgot. I'd have to have lists because the names just sort of come in, and then the names arrive, and I create the squad, and even by that point, I do not even know what gender they happen to be. Just the names have arrived, and then I give them their abilities. And again, I don't ascribe gender until I'm actually forced to by putting them into the story. So, yeah, it's all sort of ability based more than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Matt commented the Jade Soul scenes is the trippy craziness at the end of 2001 Space Odyssey.
Yeah. Well, don't forget, I read a lot of science fiction, but I read a lot of nonfiction, especially philosophy, and weird other shit. So it's not too surprising that was trippy.
I certainly struggle with the ending of that film as well.
Well, there you go. Yeah, who didn't?
Biggest Bad was a fun to write. Korab, Bilhan.
Yeah. He's almost a counterpoint to Karsa in many ways, right? I mean, he's he's similar to Carson now that I think about it. Almost a slightly different take on the Karsa style character. I mean, both were sort of initially founded upon misplaced beliefs in their leaders, gods, whatever you want to call them. And there's an earnestness to Korab, which was certainly great fun to write. And I mean, I do like going into characters and doing some stream of consciousness style writing. And his voice turned out to be a lot of fun. And especially, I think after his mushrooms or whatever he was taking at the time. Yeah, good fun.
That brings up an interesting point that I think it's fresh in our minds because we've been reading both series. But it's interesting comparing the themes of worship and Malazan to Baker.
Right. Yeah. They're very different, those themes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Almost, opposites.
Pretty much, I would think.
Yeah. What do you think, Katerina, with Baker being fresh in your mind too?
Man,
Sorry?
Oh, I was seeing if Katerina had thoughts on that because we've been reading the series together.
I think that's a really hard question to answer on the spot, to be honest. I think maybe Baker focuses on all the other things about faith besides actual faith or people believing in God. And I mean, just the gods in Malazan I think play a very different role than they do in Baker's work. They're much more active and much more present in the scenes, whereas in Baker they remain very much mysterious for most of the books, I would say. But I have to do some heavy thinking to give you an answer that I would be actually content with.
Sorry, I know it's late for you. It's so I don't want us springing on you. Also had a question. What's the weird other shit?
You're quoting me, and I've already forgotten what I was saying.
Oh, you said the stream of consciousness portions that you like to write. You kind of go off on.
Well, yeah, doesn't he, or has that not happened yet? Doesn't he get completely stoned at one point?
Hiborik?
No, Korab.
Oh.
Maybe not yet. Not yet.
I think also is asking because you said you read a lot of weird other shit.
Oh, other shit that way. Okay.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff. Human evolution books, cosmology, quantum stuff. I'm sort of all over the place. I'm rereading Julian Jaynes right now. His book, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, which is one of my favorite titles ever. It's a great book. It's a fabulous book.
That's the next book. Yeah. JD comments. You really create a lot of soldiers that we care a lot about for them to start as ability based. Very cool insight to your process.
Well, the ability and their names. Quite often, the name is something that really sends me in a particular direction with that character, and sometimes the opposite of what the name implies. But it's still a direction that's related to that name in some fashion. And then it's more a case of if I'm going to use them as a point of view, I sort of step lightly to begin with, usually, until I kind of find my feet and figure out who they are and what they're up to. Other ones just blast their way onto the page and they're in place immediately. So it varies.
Matt's wondering if you have any other good, or what other good SSF have you read this year?
All right, I'm going to go out on a real limb here. I've been reading a self-published series, and I guess it's Amazon is publishing them, and I'm really actually quite impressed. And the author's name is B.B. Larson, And the titles are all kind of Steel World, Dust World, Home World, Machine World, etc. And I'm ripping through them right now, and I'm actually really the writing's good. The characterization's fantastic. It's sort of, if you can imagine a Jack Reacher in space, in a military setting. It's a good character and quite consistent all the way through. So yeah, I've been having a blast with that stuff.
It's added to the list. And that's a lot of the weird shit he also reads too.
Yeah, I'm kind of all over the place when it comes to that stuff.
And I did not forget your comment, Frank, if you're still here. Which hockey teams do you cheer for?
The Winnipeg Jets and the Edmonton Oilers. I know. They're doing okay right now. That's okay.
Nice. So we don't want to keep you too long.
No,
Katerina
I'm all right.
or Layla, did you have any questions that?
I did. Yeah, I have a few actually,
Cool.
but one I want to circle back to, Fellison the Younger and Haborik. And Haborik did heal, is it Sibylla? Do I have her name right?
Solara.
Solara. Oh,
Layla.
he healed her, but in this book anyway, he did not heal Fellison the Younger. And then now it seems he's still with her. So he could still heal her, but that would maybe undercut the reason Crocus or Cutter is with her. So,
He may not have, I don't remember, but he may not be aware that she needs healing.
okay.
If there's no obvious observable injury.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, there's plenty more to come from that group of characters. You're going to meet them again. So.
Yeah, and there seems to be a significance of spiders. Like we have a spider with a snake's, lure, I guess. A spider who lures prey by pretending to be a snake. And then we have Isgirl-Puss' wife, who is a diverse.
Yeah, she's a diverse into spiders. Yeah.
Who can turn into spiders. So I don't know, is that a read and find out?
Not necessarily. I mean, you're going to meet Hellion, or have you met Hellion yet?
No.
Not sure.
No?
Okay.
No? Right. Okay. Wait till you meet Hellion. She'll tell you all about spiders.
Okay.
I mean, I don't mind spiders. Spiders in the house, I never kill them. They go outside. I put them, put the glass on top and postcard underneath and send them out. I've had a pet tarantula when I was much younger in university, Mexican red and black tarantula named Quiche Lorraine. And she used to escape everywhere. She would escape, get out of the aquarium, and I'd have to hunt through the house until I found her. So I like spiders.
Me too. We have orb weavers here in Missouri where
Yes, of course.
they weave those giant webs and just sit there, and I love them. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't want to be bitten by a spider, but yeah.
It was a spider bite that at least to my mind came as close to killing me as anything I've experienced before, and that was in Mongolia. Yeah. Even though there's not supposed to be any venomous spiders in Mongolia. Take it from me, there is.
Yeah. Another question I have is I've missed the significance of diamonds, like significance to Isgirl-Puss, and why Callum brought them, why Cotillion couldn't just give them to Isgirl-Puss himself, or am I mixing up the chain of possession of the diamonds?
You know what? I don't even remember.
Okay.
Other people are going to have to weigh in on that one.
Yeah. And I think one other just idea that's hanging out in the back of my mind is the characterization of Lacine, because we only really know Lacine from a little, a bit in Gardens of the Moon, but I was not aware at that time as much as I am now. And now she almost seems to be, I'm going back to the whole, thing about luck and fortune, just, very, it's very unpredictable. And she seems to have schemes within schemes. And it's really her influence that is causing all of this other mayhem to go on, and I just find that very fascinating that for example, when Tavore sent Felison to the mines, and, did all she did to her family, her parents, Lacine would have already known that Ganos Perrin was not, had not dishonored his family. I mean, she had to have known that. So,
well, hard to say, right? I mean, quite often what happens to somebody who's at the very top of the hierarchy is information has to go through many filters to reach them and may never reach them. Not only that, the triggering of the act of the nobility cull, it's not the first time that's happened in the empire. And it acquires its own momentum for sure. So Tavore had basically, two options, right? Either kill her sister or send her away. And by sending her away, she at least gave her the chance. And she put things in place to assist in that matter. It was the best she could do. So, yeah, you'll see more of Lacine, especially in the Bone Hunters.
Yeah, I just found it fascinating that, like Lestara was saying, I'm going to be loyal to the Empress, and everyone's talking about loyalty, and yet we haven't seen the Empress. We haven't seen the impact of whether she cares about the loyalty or not. And I guess I was using the example of the Perrin family to kind of make those assumptions. If she's not paying attention to them,
Yeah, I mean, the thing with it is really a reversal of a lot of what you see in sort of Eurocentric medieval epic fantasies, where the story is very much focused on those people in power. But most of us live our lives nowhere near those people in power, and yet their decisions, their actions and inactions have this. It's not just a trickle down effect; it's an avalanche effect. And but I want to be down there on the ground, and that experience of things where you don't have the answers to these questions. You don't know the motivations of your rulers. You don't know to the extent to which they're compromised, or whether they're ethical or not. But you have to deal and live with the consequences.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's there's this kind of shifting gears for a minute, but there's this whole thing in history, now, or over the last 30 years, I guess, the history from below and
social history,
micro history and that kind of thing, where you're looking at the lives of individual people, and this, I'm kind of relating that to this now too.
Absolutely. And I mean, it was long overdue in terms of history. It was one of my minors, was history, and social history is it's where, to me, it's where the interesting stuff is, because it's on a human scale as opposed to a monumental or imperial scale, which is a different kind of history and doesn't really take you anywhere. It's just basically a succession of rising and falling of empires, and it's like, okay, that's done. Now what? So it takes social historians, cultural anthropologists, and that kind of thing to really start examining some of the assumptions that we've made regarding our past, and kind of dismantling those assumptions, which is long overdue for sure.
Mhm. Yeah.
Judy Reason had a question. What are your and Eslamant's most fleshed out characters before you decided to create the books?
Most fleshed out. If I had to guess, this is going to sound weird. Animander Rake, some of Kaladin Brood, I think, on my part, and for Cam, it would have been Osric. I'm trying to think if there were. Well, no. Okay, obviously, Cotillion or Dancer and Wu, Kellenbed. Yeah, they were there at the beginning. Well, almost the beginning.
It's a great question.
Here's a writing question relating to that. How do you ever find yourself writing autobiographically in a character? Because when they say and it's true, when you first start writing, you tend to be autobiographical in your writing. People do. So do you find yourself having to step back at a certain time and saying, no, this character would make this decision, is not the decision I would make? How
I certainly try to. Okay, it's funny because I'm actually writing about this in my book on writing right now, and it's one of the things where fiction deviates from reality to a large extent, but it's expected to, and that is the notion of consistent characters.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's an expectation among readers when you're reading a book that the character needs to be consistent throughout the story. Now they can be evolving, they can be changing in that respect, but that at some core level they are consistent. The reality is none of us are consistent. We're profoundly inconsistent as individuals, and we can carry contradictory notions in our heads, and at least I'm perfectly comfortable with that in my own mind. So it is kind of a conceit to think in terms of characterization and consistency within a story, but at the same time, stories often need that, and so you kind of have to walk that tightrope on these things, and allow your characters enough room to do batshit crazy stuff that is just not consistent with who they were. But if they can then turn around and give you a reason for why they did it, then it should stand. It should be part of the story. Now, in terms of autobiographical, no, I would say I may use particular details to add verisimilitude to the set, the scene that I'm writing, which we all have to do. I mean, it's what we've observed of our world that we make use of in creating our fictional worlds. So what else could we do, right? So there'll be maybe small elements and some sort of little autobiographical tidbits here and there, and those will show up. But generally, I want to sink into the characters and their world as much as I possibly can. And then I'm just sort of, I'm throwing on various masks and living out those roles.
Joanna commented, I tend to enjoy characters that are inconsistent at times. Contradictions seem realistic.
Yes, I agree. Absolutely, Joanna. Yeah. And, characters that are constantly consistent, they could get pretty boring, right? And, everybody else around them will be able to predict pretty easily what they're going to do, which seems to be not a good survival tactic. It's like in fencing, right? When I was fencing, if I fell into any kind of pattern of movement or pacing or, 2 steps advancing, 1 retreating, and then counterattacking and that kind of stuff, I'd be toast, right? You've got to break everything up. You cannot be consistent. You cannot be predictable. And you cannot fall into those rhythms. So I mean, sword fighting alone should tell you that don't become predictable in any respect.
Matt commented, I don't know if there was a reason, but Kalam had to use the diamond before he gave some of them to Pust.
Yeah, you may well be right, Matt. I have no memory of that subplot at all. So,
GD Raising, Lacine figured someone should be in power. If the Emperor doesn't seem to care, you got to read some Messelmont.
Yeah, absolutely. She plays a huge role in Return of the Crimson Guard. Yeah.
Also, what do you think of the book Dawn of Everything?
Oh man, it's one of my favorite books. It's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, that's David Graeber, who recently passed away, and David Wingrove, an archaeologist and an anthropologist, completely dismantling the paradigm of the rise of civilization. Fabulous, fabulous stuff.
My reading schedule is getting pretty pretty passionate with this conversation. That's
It
part of the
sounds
fun.
fascinating, though. That it does.
What?
No, it sounds fascinating.
Oh, it is. It is. Yeah, David Graeber also did one, I think, 10,000 Years of Debt. He talks about the history of debt, DEBT. Also fantastic.
Writing these down.
Yeah.
Before we go, I may just want to go very quickly back to Felicin once more, because she's just such a wonderful, fascinating character. I absolutely adore her in Dead House Gates, and she went on a terrible, but what a journey she goes through in that book, and the way Dead House Gates ends. I was, and maybe I was naive. Well, obviously I was naive in thinking that she by becoming the sheikh, she was given this new opportunity to, as we sort of talk about, reinvent herself and maybe sort of come into her own. And it was very disheartening to then see her as the sheikh in House of Chains, and to see that despite all the trauma, like what really happens is just the goddess eventually takes over her, and she has very little agency once again. So I was wondering, if was that always the ending you intended for Felicin, or was there ever hope that she might find some peace?
Well, I mean, maybe she did find peace in the end, but the clash between the sisters was always going to be the end of the fourth book, and there were a number of reasons for that. One, things that I ramped things up a fair bit with Dead House Gates in its conclusion, right? So you think it's sort of kind of monumental in terms of the involvement of everything. So huge scale. And then I felt in Memories of Ice, I actually upped it yet again, one more time. But I did not want to fall into that pattern of going for the great spectacle at the end of every book. So I thought with the fourth book, I would completely inverse it. And I'd go back to a lot of what inspired me to start all of this stuff, which was, of course, the Iliad. And you can look at the Iliad in terms of the huge siege on a grand scale, but the story itself is not about that siege. It's about the individuals and their contests and their fights, and ultimately Achilles and Priam. So that's what I was trying to echo with this one. This was going to come down to two people on a field between two armies and deciding everything at that point. So yeah, it was turning the focus, turning it around, just to sort of, I guess, not fall into a particular pattern of storytelling and structure. And then, of course, I realized that I needed to make sure that Tavor never knew who it was that she killed. So that was the other side of things. And in terms of the control of the goddess over Felicin, that control slips briefly. And that's kind of what sort of leads to her demise. She has a moment when she finds herself again. And to me, I needed that for the tragic aspect of things, for that conclusion. But yeah, it was certainly going for a kind of a messy ending, in that respect. Yeah.
It was heartbreaking to read, and I'm sad about how Felicin ends up, but well, at least I'm happy that we have her as a character.
Okay, well, remember that scene and put that scene on a shelf, and get back to me when you're reading towards the end of The Crippled God.
Oh wow, okay. I'll keep it in mind.
Nice.
No, some of that too, I see in a loose parallel, I guess, to the Bidethal death, in that, no matter how deserving we might be, maybe this is the grim, dark side of me coming out. No matter how bad you are or how deserving you are, nothing ever wraps up neatly.
No.
I think that's what I'm getting at,
Yeah.
And because I saw Felicin as I still do, as a tragic and heroic figure. I mean, she went through a lot and survived, and
Yeah, and that survival legacy lives on in the renamed daughter, right? Felicin.
Right.
So the name carries on. Yeah.
Yeah. I think my last question is, will we see Grub again?
Yeah.
Read and find out. Okay. It looked like the promise was there. So.
But not in the way you expect. So.
Okay.
But take that as a given, right?
Yeah.
It won't be in the way you expect things. That's kind of the rule throughout the entire series, actually.
Yeah. But he basically has given the Bone Hunters their name, by his original innocent act with the thigh bone.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
The time always flies on these.
It does.
It just flies by. But we know you're very busy. We really appreciate you taking time to come and
it's been
chat
fun
with us. Yeah.
Good fun. Yeah. Well, I look forward to hearing your comments on Midnight Tides for sure. Talk about messy endings. Yeah, you just wait.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
Layla, if I'm sorry, Katerina, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to thank Mr. Erikson for joining us and allowing us to ask all these questions. And I'm also curious what you think of Midnight Tides, because I've already read it, and it's one of my favorites. So.
All right. Cool.
It's
curious about your
quite
thoughts.
standalone, isn't it? It's quite self-contained, that book, I think, in many respects. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could possibly even read it before reading any of the other books, and it might still work.
Yeah.
And it's quite different from the other four as well.
Yeah, a bit more deliberately Shakespearean, I think, in many respects. Yeah.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it now. Good stuff. So, Layla, if someone wants to get in touch with you, where's the best place to find you?
I guess Twitter now, either my regular El Goshi or Belatti Magazine now.
Nice. Yeah, new channel launch, and I'll be sure and add that down to the description. Everybody could go check it out. And Mr. Erikson, where's the best place for people to find your work?
Bookstores. Right now, I'm occasionally putting an essay up on my Erikson Facebook page. So I have the introduction to the book on writing is up there right now.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Cool. And Katerina, where can people get in touch with you?
You'll find me on the Page Chewing Forum, and I'm also on Instagram at The Errand.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah, might have stolen that one from you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's how far along are you again? You finished the Bone Hunters, is that right?
I finished the Bone Hunters, yes.
Right. Yeah. You might end up changing your handle at some point.
Oh no. I thought it sounded more interesting than just using my name, but okay.
Right.
Well, I might have to rebrand myself again.
You might have to. Yeah.
And for everyone here, the we are continuing to read the series. So if you want to join us or join the conversation, we are on the Page 2 in forum. Be sure and check that out and come by. I'm not sure the format we'll continue with. We were trying a book at a time, but we'll be figuring that out here soon, just to kind of get our strategy down. But anyone's welcome to join and come and chat about the series with us. So thanks again to everyone in the chat. Really appreciate everyone coming by to talk with us. It always adds to the experience. So thanks a lot for coming by and asking a bunch of great questions. And we'll see everyone next time. Hope everyone has a great weekend.
Bye.